Morena e te iwi. How are you all, beautiful book people, book lovers, here on a beautiful Marlborough day? I have been presumptuous and just decided that we're going to get rolling because we want to take advantage of all the time we can to have Anna Smaill here. Called Jane Forrest Waghorn, I hope. I'm very grateful to be here and to be here after a decade. This has become an important part of our lives in Marlborough, and it is a great joy to welcome those of you who've come from afar, so thank you for coming, and especially to authors, because we're all author groupies, and we think that they are the heroes and the voices of our society. So thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
For coming here. I'm going to talk to Anna today about Bird Life, her newest novel, and at the end we will have an opportunity for some questions. So let's begin, shall we, Anna? Welcome. Anna, I think we have to go back a little before we get to Bird Life. We have to put it into context of your career as a writer.
Sure, yeah.
And I think we're all intrigued by the fact that writing wasn't your first career, was it?
No, I mean, I sort of had a very idealistic perception of what careers would look like when I was sort of a young person deciding what my vocation was. So I think I did always factor in writing. It was definitely going to be, I definitely felt that I would have this sort of perfectly balanced career where I'd write and I'd express the things I wanted to in writing, but I was a musician, I wanted to express through music as well. And, I remember for our career, you do world of work at high school and everyone goes off and, be's a baby lawyer for a week or does something like that or goes to the hospital and helps out. And I just had no idea what to do. And I remember I actually ended up going to the Auckland Domain and helping out in the nursery there because that seemed at least like a practical, useful thing. But I think I wasn't very career-minded as a young person. I just sort of thought, well, I'll keep learning and I'll keep sort of practicing. That was my big thing, to practice and to kind of get better. And that was sort of applied to both writing and music. But yes, I think it's sort of so when I sort of first thought, well, what do I do at university? The performance music was sort of the goal because that would advance you and it would open up that possibility. Of course, as I've talked about, probably more with the Chimes because that was a book of so patently about music. I did a year of performance violin and then hastily quit that. It's been a twisty, turny pathway, I think, in some ways for me. But I do vividly remember the moment of quitting and realising I've got to put this sort of the energy of music and the expressive purpose of music, I've got to put it somewhere, like just to survive, like I've got to have a trajectory for it.
So that's really interesting to me. Creatively, how different is playing music to writing words or creating story?
I mean, very, very practically different. I think for me, the key thing, and we're talking about this as friends as well, is the time-bound element of music. You've got this one, if you're performing, you've got this one opportunity to completely deliver your interpretation, your performance. And, there's no opportunities really for mistake at that point. You've got practice, which kind of galvanizes you and prepares you for that, which is its own discipline. But then that space, and it's so sort of brutal, you can't escape from that temporal experience of delivery. And I just think that's where I just didn't fit. For me, there's something in writing, it's an iterative process. You make a mistake and nobody knows about it. You go, oh, fuck, and you go and you try and work it out, but then you come back. And I think for me, it's those multiple opportunities to come back and, oh, that's not what I meant, but that you can do it again. And that's the sort of creative space that I want to live in, I guess.
Just before you were talking a little bit about Chimes to somebody at the door, and I thought it was really interesting when you said you send that book out. So you're talking about the writing process now, then you create this beautiful piece of fiction, and the Chimes undoubtedly was, and it was enormously successful. I mean, that must have been extraordinary to get on the long list. It was the long list, amazing.
Yes.
But how does that change your feeling about that book at that time? I'm going to stop talking about it in a minute.
No, I mean, it is such a strange process, publication in general, I think. And it's so divorced from the act of writing in so many ways. And it's a really private experience of writing a book. And yet they're inextricably connected, obviously, because not very many people, I think, would sit down and spend the immense amount of time and energy that is required to put out a work of fiction without thinking that you're doing it to communicate and that you're doing it ultimately to send it out into the world. So there's this sort of cognitive dissonance, I think, that you go through. But with the chimes, I think the thing that was so exciting about it for me was that I was doing it under the radar. And I think this is a very fertile space for me, maybe for many writers. But, you know, my husband, Carl, who's in the audience there, he was the novelist. And we'd met in the creative writing MA in Wellington, and I did poetry and he did fiction. And that was quite a comfortable co-location of vocations. So I was sort of writing this book thinking, oh, can I write a novel? I don't know if I could write a novel, but I seem to be writing something that seems to be a novel. And it was fun. It was fun. I think that was the great thing about it. And yet I think there was some part of me that knew I wanted it, you know, the energy of it felt propulsive and I wanted it to be out there. But it does colour your experience when it goes out into the world and things
enormously successful.
Yeah.
So there's two things I'm interested in. How do you cope with that in your house? Do you have other ends of the dining table? Do you schedule writing time? Do you say it's your turn to pick up the children from school?
Yes, all of that. No, I think we're just so lucky. Like I think we met on the creative writing MA, and the wonderful thing is we became friends and readers of each other's work before we were in a relationship. And so there's that trust and I think excitement and admiration of each other's writing was sort of very much there first. And so it's wonderful because you've got a reader and you've got somebody who you trust completely to tell you what they think of your work. But yeah, there's a lot of juggling and logistics, and it has often worked out that we'll take turns, I think. So one person will be in the writing space and having that time, and the other person...
Because I think it's quite a long time since you wrote the chimes. It's 2015?
Yes.
And then fast forward to Bird Life?
Slowly, incrementally move forward, yeah.
So, you know, it's that cliche, isn't it, that the second book is always hard to write. Is that true? Is that a cliche?
Yes, I wish I could say it wasn't the case, but no. And I think it comes back to that sort of under the radar clandestine freedom. And then when you publish a book, and if you're as lucky as I was that it reached a certain number of people, and you know, there's a real self-consciousness that came with that, I think, for me. And, you know, in that sense that the first time I didn't know what I was doing, and the second time I didn't know what I was doing, but I felt like maybe I should know what I was doing a bit more. But I think the great truism of writing fiction for me is that you don't, and that you're just working it out as you go. And I think it takes a long time for that reason. I think for the reason that most writers face, if you've got a job that pays the bills and even family that, you know, we adore, but also take time and energy and mental space, then it's very difficult to get the kind of clean run into a book that you would.
So the chimes is sort of a quest, isn't it? It's a dystopian quest with lots of beautiful music in it. But that's not what Bird Life is. How would you describe Bird Life?
Yeah, I think... the Bird Life in some ways is a different kind of quest. I think, you know, it's got two intersecting characters who are on their own private journeys and own individual quests. But it's a quieter, more internal story. But then it's very much about music as well. And it's the plot of the novel is structured around the magic flute, the Mozart opera Singspiel. And you know, it's about music, but it's sort of about music in a different way, and the ways in which it shapes individual creative brain work. And, it's about vocation. So I think in many ways, there's a lot of overlap with the chimes, but they're very different worlds.
I have to say here that if you haven't read the book, there's going to be spoilers. Sorry, but you'll still enjoy the book. Because there's lots of things I want to talk about. Now, first of all, I was talking about the book to somebody and I said it's got magical realism in it. And they said, what's that? And so I'm going to ask
me to define it.
Yes, please. I have got a definition here. But
I don't have like a textbook definition at all.
How is it within bird life?
Yeah, well, I think realism is a very strange thing. We have this construct in fiction that's an agreed kind of assumption of what the real world is and feels like. But I don't really feel that that's necessarily true for everybody. And I think the ways in which people navigate the real or build the real for themselves can be so diverse, and the experience of that can be so broad. I think this is possibly also where coming from poetry shifts my sense of where that genre distinction lies, because nobody blinks an eye if in poetry saying, and then, the tree caught on flames and I was incandescent with it. And because we accept that we write in metaphor, and metaphor is its own way of capturing what something felt like or feels like. So I think that's where the novel that is exploring the different ways, story and imagery are embedded in our real. But it's about madness, and it was about finding ways of finding the sort of objective correlative for that experience of madness. And so you've got animals who speak, or you've got signs and announcements of various, possible futures. So, I think the writers who I most love, Janet Frame, they sort of see this as a spectrum. Reality is something we choose to define as this thing, but there's actually a lot.
Yeah, it's that thing of when you start to look at that terms, it doesn't really work, does it?
Yeah.
It creates an image of Harry Potter, really.
Yeah,
But I think it's really important here if we start talking about the characters. So if those who haven't know who we're talking about, because they're really important, and obviously because they're characters in the book, but we've got two central protagonists.
That's right, yeah.
Where did they come from? And tell us about them.
Yeah, sure. I think there's a lot of autobiography in this book as well. There's obvious clear invention and distinctions, but I was a young New Zealand woman, travelled to Tokyo, not by myself, with my then partner, now husband, and in many ways I sort of wanted to capture that experience of sort of alienation, culture shock, and what it's like just to be in a completely different culture, which you may or may not have much sort of historical awareness of. And then I think in the character of Yasuko, again, I kind of wanted to, honour sort of female friendships that I had at that time, of that sort of intensity where you meet somebody sort of across completely different cultural experiences, and yet there's a sort of sudden intimacy that seems to open up a world for you. And I guess in the character of Yasuko, who is an older Japanese woman who befriends Dinah, who's the young New Zealand woman who travels to Tokyo essentially as a kind of a grief displacement act. So she's lost her twin brother, and she's travelled, I think, as a sort of almost like a further systematic derangement of her experiences and senses, a sort of a slightly masochistic impulse. Because I think she's dealing with a lot of guilt as well, sort of survivor guilt that her brother has died. And then Yasuko, yes, she was sort of an embodiment, I guess, of all of the things that Dinah wasn't. Dinah's sort of struggling with her own selfhood. She's not comfortable in her body. She's sort of, I guess, sort of forming an identity for herself. Whereas Yasuko seems like a consummately polished, impeccably groomed person who sort of knows exactly how to perform her femininity and knows how to sort of control her persona in public. And yet she's a character who's also sort of suffering and has also had this divided experience of reality. So, yeah, I mean, Yasuko in particular just kind of popped off the page for me.
Did she?
Yeah, whereas Dinah, I think it's an interesting thing when you're writing characters that are sort of almost closer to your own experience. I find it technically much, much harder because you actually, you forget what you need to characterize, because a lot of the things you think of, you're characterizing because they're normal for you or sort of a default for you. You forget to shade them in, I think, because they sort of just, assume their presence, yeah.
I think that another character for me in the book, and that I mentioned that to you earlier, is indeed Tokyo. Yeah. Because there are no geishas, there are no temples or multiple cherry trees or all the tourism tropes that we associate with Japan. And indeed that beauty, I mean, Yasuko is very beautiful and very polished and things like that, but it's in a different sort of way. But the city itself in the book is quite bleak.
That's interesting.
The apartments, the way they live, the routine of life, the catching the train, the lunch.
I think that vision of Tokyo is probably also, it's very much Dinah's vision. So she's in the, I was trying to kind of, I guess, embody her perception of the city because it's so much shaped by her grief and by the sense, the sort of sensory world has been sort of emptied out for her. And she's in this, she's sort of almost seeking to perpetuate it in the physical world. She's got these sort of routines and these, the things that she sees are very much as a reflection of her sense of estrangement from the world. I think it's really interesting in Tokyo because you're right, the sort of tourist perceptions we have, they're very present, but they're also, it's a place and it's a cliche, but it's a city of contrasts, and as Japan is a city, it's both sort of hyper modern, it's the Blade Runner kind of vision, and is also tiny sort of roadside shrines and women in yukata and kimono in summer inhabiting the past and the present very much. Yeah, very topical. And, if you have eyes to see it, that those constant overlaps and the sort of, that palimpsest is a great literary word, but it's very real in Tokyo because you can see all these layers. And I think in particular because it's a city where there's a great sense of temporariness. And I think that's one of the things where you sort of have to almost train yourself to see it as a city. Like I think when I first arrived, I was like, oh, this is ugly. This is a sort of an ugly place, because things temporary. The sort of ways in which I think the Western eye sort of expects kind of edifices and old buildings and established structures, whereas Tokyo is sort of being built and rebuilt, and that's part of the culture and the sort of aesthetic of the city. So yeah, it is a character in the book. Because I think it made a huge physical and sensory impression on me. It's a fascinating place.
And they walk in the city such a lot in the book.
Yes.
Actually a physical experience of the air or the... Yeah.
Well, to me, I tend to write in sort of sense impressions and textures, and I think it was the same with the chimes. I don't necessarily have like a very detailed geographical understanding or sort of historical understanding, but I want to capture that sort of feeling of being in the city. And I think for me, in Tokyo, it was just very sensory. It's the smell, there's so much concrete and it's got a particular smell, especially when it's sort of being cooked in the sun, and it gives off this kind of proteiny kind of skin-like smell, and it feels like you're living inside an organism, it's a very strange experience. But I think the walking and the air, for me, one of the defining experiences of Tokyo is just feeling that like it's benign and it's safe, and you could just walk quite comfortably, like through a night and through a city. And coming from New Zealand, where I think, as a young woman, you're sort of always schooled to, keep your keys between your fingers and, you
wouldn't sleep in the park.
You wouldn't do any of that. And, I didn't do that either, but it felt possible. It felt like this. But I also feel like that's, there's a wonderful kind of double edge there, because that safety comes at a different cost. And it is illusory as well. Obviously, any city, any big city, there are dangers. But I think almost that sense of floating, or the kind of disconnect, that benign air you're moving, it's sort of almost an anesthesia as well, and it does make you forget, or it does make you...
And that's sort of how Diana is operating, isn't she?
Yes.
Almost in a drugged state.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I keep thinking of Joan Didion's book, My Year of Magical Thinking.
Oh, yeah.
And which is a book about her grief after the death of her husband. And I think I kept thinking of that term when I kept thinking of her.
Oh, I'm so pleased, because that's very much what I was hoping to capture, yeah.
Yes. So Dinah starts to see Michael. In a way, the book then becomes a ghost story, doesn't it?
Yes, yeah.
Because he's very real. He's not just a thought or a grief. He's actually a physical manifestation.
Yeah, and I love that dissonance of, the idea that it's... a movie I think made quite a big impression on me was Truly, Madly, Deeply.
Oh, yes, I know.
Lots of
love
nods,
that.
yeah. And I love that sort of idea that you sort of, a way of coping with grief is you sort of manifest this physical, being who heals the grief. And yet that part of that is a kind of you return to all the things that irritated you about them.
Yes, that's quite gorgeous when she starts getting sick of them.
Yeah, and it's a sort of I think particularly in this case for Dinah, because she lost Michael so abruptly, and it's part of that working through of, that she hasn't had a chance to say goodbye. But I really very much, I love the fact that you said it's a ghost story, because I think I did want it to feel like a ghost story.
Yeah.
But I wanted, right through the novel, both with Yasuko and with Dinah, wanted to feel like both possible realities were sort of being held in balance throughout, so that, it is a ghost story, and it is sort of magic, but there's also, I guess, a realist reading where, no, she's delusional and she's manifesting.
Yeah. And I had to go back and reread, and I'll talk to you about the last chapter, because I thought, have I read this right? And I went back and read it several times, because I was checking to see, because at this stage, I think I probably found Dinah, because she's a New Zealand girl and thing, and her grief was culturally more part of our lives. But can we talk about Yasuko? Because she's just fascinating, and her special power. Do you tell us about her special power? Where did that come from?
I think that really was one of the first parts of the book. So Yasuko is sort of, she's a character who I think it's about 14, 15, she develops this incredible visionary power, but then she loses it, and it's sort of taken from her, and the rest of her life is sort of a negotiating with how do you reconnect with that gift, which has shaped your sense of, it's the highest possible experience of reality.
Yeah.
And I think for me that came from, probably from music to a certain degree, not my own, partly my own experience, but I don't know, there's a quality I think of that most people who engage with art or create art in whatever way will be familiar with. Because when you have this wonderful access to inspiration and you're writing and you feel, it's coming from somewhere else, or it's kind of tapping into sort of a subconscious experience. And it does feel like magic. It feels like you're kind of, it's visionary. But then there's also the flip side of that, which is the workaday world, or when you can't access that. And so, there's this real potential, I think, for artists to have that binary experience of tapping into the real world and then tapping out. And I think that's what I wanted to capture in Yasuko, is that the intensity of that.
So Yasuko has basically raised her son
June,
on her own. And in a way that she lost her... Did she lose her power during motherhood?
Well,
or that intense mothering time?
There's a... a kind of an ambiguity throughout the novel, that because she often thinks it's come back to her, and she has these experiences of sort of dipping back into the power, but then she has to return to a sort of a world, or she doesn't feel like it doesn't continue.
Yeah.
And the
disappointment of that.
The disappointment of that, yeah. And that she also has to commit to a real world in order to raise her son in a pragmatic day-to-day situation where you've got to get your kids to school and you've got to dress them and you've got to earn enough money to feed them. And so the novel, and I'll read a bit about that particular moment, but the novel, you know, one of the inciting incidents of the novel is the moment at which her son leaves her, because this tension between them of like, which real world are you living in, has sort of been building. And the moment in which she meets Dinah, where she connects properly with Dinah, is a moment where she's sort of given back into her vision of the powers, and she feels that suddenly her powers have returned, and it's sort of a transfiguring experience. But I think I wanted it to feel like you weren't sure if that was true or not.
Yeah. And why beetles? Why not just birds? Why cats? Why?
I think it was. I don't know. I think it's the familiar animals of Tokyo as well. You know,
Right.
this sense of, you know, because cats, that's a real thing I experienced there. You know, the whole population of feral or sort of stray cats that just seem to roam around the city. I mean, it's a bit of a cliche of Japanese literature, these kind of wandering cats, of course, in Murakami, but Miyazaki as well. This sense of, and it's this sort of animistic world, I guess, of things and creatures, you know.
Yeah.
Giving.
So just because you've said that, how important then are those Japanese authors in influencing your writing of this book?
They were definitely present. I mean, I read Murakami at sort of in my early 20s, and just adored it, you know, adored them. I've not come back to them as much maybe as some other writers, but Banana Yoshimoto was a novelist who I read at university. I think the kind of defining influence there for me was the sense of texture. You know, there's a calm kind of quality to Murakami's work, I guess, to others, where it's sort of just about inhabiting that daily world, and then there are these sort of subtle deviations which can potentially throw you right out. But I mean, it's another example of a writer who I think uses magical realism to great effect. And in some way it feels as though it's sort of embodying or enacting just parts of reality. It doesn't feel like fantasy per se. It's always got a kind of a meaning.
So in a way, it's almost just a way of your personal lens on your everyday life.
Yeah,
Is that right?
I think so. Yeah.
Do you want to read us that bit?
Yeah, I'll read the bit. Actually, it's good timing because this is a section where Yasuko finally comes back. She's had this ongoing flirtation of is it, isn't it? And then she's at last reunited with her powers. She walked through the city all day. By Shinobazu Pond, Yasuko leaned deeper, her head closer to the smooth skin of the water. Please, she said gently. The fish were moving, rising. A pattern became clear in their movements. They were circling toward her. One of the fish came up. It rose so far that its snout broke above the surface, and she felt her face move without her control. Yasuko sat forward. I have come to tell you, she said, that my son has left me. I would appreciate your help. The fish's snout sat suspended, still, out of the water. Then it turned. It did not speak. The carp subsided back into the pond's mute gloom. It left behind a pattern of cords and tension in the water. The surface pulled smooth like a calloid scar. It was futile. She had known that it would be. After all of these times, why should today be any different? There was no pain. All she felt was a sort of numb cloudiness. She thought for a second of a picture in one of her father's books, something that happened to divers when they rose too quickly, a crystalline flowering in the blood. She nodded. That was that. She'd missed the whole day of work. How late it was. She stood and looked up at what remained of the day, the sun dull above the towers of Ueno's shopping district, a white sky, its patience greater than hers, greater than anyone's. She walked, slowly at first, then with greater speed, back across the bridge, back past the museums and toward the station. She passed the fountain and the concourse where the courting couples walked and sat. The park was filling. A trio of young men walked toward her, one of them carrying a red soft drink crate. When she was halfway down the concourse, she stopped suddenly, arrested by her shoe. Her heel had become caught in the earth between two concrete pavers. She hopped off balance, found her footing, then yanked. But she'd misjudged both the force of her movement and the stubbornness of the earth. The slender heel held firm. She wobbled once, twice, and went over, shedding the shoe, putting out her hands instinctively. Her Wolford stockings erupted into a spider's web of runs. It was in that position, on her hands and knees, her cheeks burning with shame and injustice, looking at the fountain, that she saw the peacock. On the pale grey concrete, the bird stood, its immense tail spread out like the cape of a tired monarch. People walked past, a young foreign woman in business clothes, an older couple pushing their adult child in a wheelchair, a group of high school boys. They each passed without a glance, so close that they could have stroked its feathers, but none of them did, because it had appeared solely for her. When her powers returned, Yasuko wondered that she could ever have mistaken the earlier episodes as the real thing. She wondered at how much she had forgotten. Her stomach moved up into her throat. Her heart opened like a fist and started to speed. Hope waved to her like a handkerchief, far off, almost beyond her range of vision. She recognised its sharp white colour and the uptick in her bloodstream. She felt the old intoxicant drip of ego. Everything sharpened as if she had turned a lens. No, she said, but it was impossible to fight the tide of mercy that crept up her throat and into her face. It was only right, after all that she'd had to put up with, the work she'd put into making her life. From a crouch on her knees, she spoke, under her breath, but loud enough to be heard. She was afraid. She'd forgotten the terror. "Please," she said, "leave me alone." The peacock walked idly in her direction on its clawed feet. It turned its head on the periscope of its neck and blinked, so that she saw herself briefly reflected in a dark eye before the life-occluding shutter of its lid lowered once, twice. "We know you are suffering," it said. "We have been watching you." The opulence and richness of its plumage was awful. It spoke without opening its beak. "You are not alone." Absence had marked her life for as long as she could remember. The shape of something hard and heavy that had pressed down, and the bloodless grass after it had been removed. She wanted to show her anger. She wanted to resist. But in the end, she was like a wronged wife who gives up her oath of silence at her husband's first kind word. She looked warily at the messenger and she felt the rush of relief that was headier than any drug. It slipped along her veins. Even in her grief, she felt the pleasure that was her whole body being returned to her. She could feel her skin. She could feel the nerve endings all along her heels, her knees within the intricate web of her stockings, her fingers moving against the gravel. It was all at once given back. She couldn't bear to look around because she knew she would see the clouds moving with alarming purpose. She knew that outside the station, every blade of grass would hold a further message. She leaned forward on her hands helplessly. Even the pain in her skin was a delight. A trickle of blood curled down from her knee. And she saw that, of course, the two things were connected. June had left and her powers had returned. That was the trade-off. That was the reward. "Is that why you came back?" she wanted to ask. She did not say it out loud. At the height of her suffering, she knew that if called on to make a choice, this time she could not say which she would choose. "Have you really come back?" she asked instead, "after all of these years?" "Oh yes," the bird said, "we are going to help you." Its eye was fringed and blank. "Remain alert. We are sending you a girl." "A girl? What good's a girl? What kind of girl?" But already the bird had reared, and its wings flexed like the muscles on a swimmer's back. It moved into the air.
Birds appear quite important in the book, obviously, because it's called Bird Life.
Yeah.
But why did you choose to call it Bird Life?
Well, that's an interesting story, actually. It wasn't the working title. It was for a long time, the Word document that I was working on was the bird catchers. So, because I wanted to, because it was based on the Mozart novel, opera, and, the character of Papageno and the magic flute, the bird catcher, and then obviously there's the trope of, being caught, and there's a scene which reflects that moment in the magic flute where the bird catcher is kind of the highlight. But just before it was, I think it was when my agent was still reading it and it hadn't been sent out to publication yet, I was alerted to the fact that there was a book that came out that year by a very well-known writer. Well, I didn't know her, but she was well-known overseas, called The Bird Catchers, maybe it was The Bird Catcher and mine was The Bird Catchers. So, yes, best laid plans and all that, but, yeah.
Yeah, I particularly was, because it doesn't just stay with her. I mean, Dinah has an encounter with the crow, doesn't she?
And I think actually, as appalled as I was by the fact that I was going to again have to change the title because China's was a difficult one too, I actually think it's a better title. I think Bird Life captures the sort of the novel in a better way, maybe.
Yeah.
I think I really wanted to get that sense of it being, there's these multiple channels of existence in the book. And there's the human world, or there's a world of particular types of human experience. And then, the animal world just sort of continues on in its own time frame and experience. And that's sort of, I guess, I wanted to get that sense of different worlds, different lives.
The cats are quite funny. The cats and the men on the motorbikes.
Yeah.
Was sort of a hilarious break in the midst of it all, really.
That scene, the men on the motorbikes, that's a real sort of observed phenomenon in that space. I remember sort of, we actually lived in Itabashi, which is pretty much where the novel where Dinah's living. And it's one stop from Ikebukuro on the Saikyo line. And, you'd come across this, a walking bridge across the tracks, and there were these men in their elaborate, leathers and with these incredibly expensive motorbikes. And in Tokyo, it's, got these small, narrow streets that but they're sitting there. It's almost a sort of a performative experience of showing yourself fully garbed and sort of, it's like a kind of a cosplay, I guess, that you're sort of occupying that character.
Do you want to explain what the cats do? Or
yeah. Well, I think that's one of the key moments where Yasuko's powers in the world that Yasuko inhabits, once she's immersed in it. As I've said, there's moments where there's plausible sort of overlap between the realities, and this is one where I created a reality that had to uphold Yasuko. So the cats come to Yasuko in a sort of a tidal stream and sort of overtake the men on their motorbikes in a kind of tsunami of cat.
Yes.
Yeah.
They aren't at all, well, they are threatening to the men, I suppose, but it was kind of gorgeous. I did love that. But I was just going to go back to the ghosts and with Michael and really it coming to an end and Dinah letting him go.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, it also reminded me a little bit of Lincoln in the Bardo, where he has all those ghosts as well. I thought that was... But I have to ask you about the final chapter, because if I was in the audience, I'd put my hand up and ask. The very final chapter, well, both endings are incredibly interesting and in a way quite challenging. I found them. Dinah's was okay. That was all, but the scene of the girl on the roof was, I just was breathless.
Yeah, I mean, I think the novel is about the perils of choosing and the perils of not choosing. I think I really wanted to explore this idea of, your life sort of occupies these tracks. And it's sometimes, it's a cliche, but we have a choice which takes us down two different opposing paths. And Dinah's always sort of moving between two possible realities because her brother Michael has had this powerful effect on her, and she's allowed herself to inhabit his world.
Yeah.
She's not really had to choose her own reality. And I think the moment you're talking about for Dinah at the end is very much a realization that she does have to choose, and that it's a hard decision to make, to choose your own reality, because it's not as glamorous or as easy or as, for her, as magical as inhabiting somebody else's sort of slightly fantastical world. But she understands that. And I think for Yasuko, there's a different kind of choice. She has decided to fully inhabit this sort of fantastical world, the world of her powers. But for her, it kind of releases her into a sort of a timelessness, I guess. And I think that's what I wanted to capture, that moment at which her sort of vision allows tragedy to be suspended. And I think that's sort of what you were wondering about, that moment she observes a tragedy, and yet it sort of she kind of enables it to just sort of sit.
Yeah, because it is a bit like flight, isn't it? It's like a bird taking flight. That's what it seemed. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. I wanted it to remain suspended, I guess. And for Yasuko, her sort of conclusion is a continual suspension. Yeah. Just before we move on towards the end, I'm also interested in the parents, in Yasuko's father, and to a lesser extent, Dinah's mother, who was also grieving. She has lost her son, but she's also trying to care for from a distance. But look, and that, I think the scene of the funeral with stain on the silk blouse is incredibly beautiful in a way, because she stains her mother's blouse, and her mother is about to go to the funeral of her brother, and as mothers do, she sort of just takes her blouse off and washes it, and puts it back on. Yeah. It's like she's waiting for Dinah. I think that's a big difference, because Dinah's got this loving mother that is waiting for her when she's ready.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, Dinah's choice at that moment, at that sort of pivotal moment in her end, is the realization of her, like the burden that her mother is carrying. Because I think that scene, that scene had to do a lot of work. And I feel like what it was doing is, paying homage to, Dinah's so immersed in her grief. She's got this magical thinking. She almost thinks, she kisses her mother, and the lipstick mark stains the top. And she's sort of like, the funeral can't happen now. It's impossible, because we can't. And it's almost released into a sense of like, nothing, she doesn't have to deal with her grief. Whereas the mother, of course, has to feel those things, but also exist in reality. And she's got to do the pragmatic work of going out and greeting people while she's suffering. So I guess it's about the decision of which reality you occupy. And sometimes you have a choice. Yeah. And sometimes you don't.
Because his father's more complex, isn't he, in a way? I don't know that I understand him.
I don't know if I fully understand him either. Yeah. He's I didn't want him to be a total villain, and I guess that was where the novel could have gone for me, because he does acts that are unforgivable. He does, but he does what he thinks is
good
right.
For her. Yeah.
And then there are different cultural pressures on that family also. So,
But he's also there the whole way through for her.
Yes, a very powerful presence. And I think, this is a book about parents and families and the ways in which we grow up in like the culture and the world and the reality of our family. And some people never separate from that, but sometimes that can be quite a brutal act of actually moving from, a family into your own vision of the real world. Yeah.
It is a lovely book. It's a beautiful book. It is gentle, and yet it has the funny moments, terribly sad moments as well. But now, do you walk away from that as that bird life? Has that bird flown now for you?
Yes, I think so. I mean, it is such a sort of it is a terrifying act, I think, completing something and putting it out. But it feels complete for me. And I think in a way, part of the pleasure of sort of putting it out into the world is that it releases you. I don't know, for me, for my second novel, it was hard. It was a hard thing to write. Largely, I sort of set myself quite different technical goals than for the Chimes. And it did take a long time. But I feel like released a little bit. I feel like I'm quite ready to play and be more sort of playful again. So I think, yeah.
Right, playful in your writing,
yes.
or just in your general life?
No, in my writing. Yeah.
So now what happens? You're a novelist. So where's book number 3?
Well, I do seem to take quite a long time to write, and I think for all the aforementioned reasons. But it's it's interesting because I had the germ of bird life before I finished the Chimes, and I had the germ of my next novel even before I'd started bird life. So I sort of have these sort of nuggets that I've keep returning to.
So how do you manage that when you're writing? Do you write it down on a little piece of paper and you just keep it tucked in your brain? I think I just keep it
tucked away somewhere, and I know that there's something there, and it's like you don't necessarily have to scrutinise it too much, but there's just something kind of pulsing that isn't enough, I guess. You kind of get the sense of scale of like, that's something I couldn't unpack in, I don't know, a poem or a short story.
And is it related? Is there any connection? Like you were saying that there is a musical connection between the Chimes and the magic flute?
Yeah, this actually feels quite different, but then I think you don't know until you see afterwards, oh yes, there's like a common thread. And I think, they're always about, in some way for me, art or kind of making things, and then how that experience clashes or doesn't clash with.
So does that surprise you when you've created it? But or is that something that is just becoming part, you understand that as part of your work?
It's always surprising, always like afterwards. I mean, I still look back on the Chimes and I sort of don't really recognise parts of it. Like I sort of don't remember where they came from.
Yeah.
I mean, I can work it out, but yeah, there is that detachment. But I remember being surprised while I've been writing both books. You sort of come into something, and that's, it's some kind of revelation. Yeah.
Cool. Now, I'm going to open the floor for anyone who has a question. There's a lovely person here with a microphone. Has anybody got a question for Anna? Certainly. Somebody, can we just bring this down because of the echoing for the people at the back?
So what's happened to Anna the poet? Is that still bubbling away in you, or are you a full-time and forever novelist now?
I'm not sure. I think poetry, it's sort of like a garden. You have to continue tending, and I think probably I've put the tools down to a certain extent, which makes me say, no, I'm not a poet at the moment. I wouldn't necessarily rule it out, but I do think I remember the moment when I started writing fiction, and poetry had been my only experience of writing recently. I guess the sense of fun it was the most compelling part of that transition, of feeling like I can just sort of explore and play and have fun. So I think that's that would be a difficult thing to step back from. But I would like to think that my brain still works in poetry in some way. Yeah, but no definitive answer.
Has anybody else got a question? To the left.
Hi, I was just curious about the apartment building that Dinah lived in. I've got a son who lives in Japan.
Oh, wow.
He's been there for a long time. Was it really empty? I'm sorry, I was just so curious that it was such an empty, lonely apartment, and then there seemed to be somebody living upstairs, and
I think
was there anything about
that? I mean, this is where technically, I wanted to keep both those realities possible. And, when Dinah goes exploring and she sort of sees there is somebody else here, it's supposed to be a sort of a check on her reality, because she's in a kind of a purgatorial kind of netherworld where I don't think we can trust her impressions.
So perhaps that was just all in her.
Yeah, perhaps a lot of it is sort of a slightly altered reality that she's
It just made me very sad.
Yeah, I know. It is. Don't worry, I'm sure your son's going to much nicer.
He's been there 10 years.
Wow, yeah. But I
think it was having a girl. I think it was the girl on her own, sort of.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's something in that I was capturing, that experience can be quite lonely. I think, it's it can be quite isolating, especially for a young person who's arrived in a different culture and don't speak the language. Yeah. And it is disorienting. So I wanted to capture that, but...
Oh, you did.
But yeah, there's a sort of a tricky, sort of slippery version, I guess, of reality that I was hoping to skate around. Because, technically I don't think that would really be
I couldn't... Well, it just seemed a bit sad that she seemed to be there all on her own.
Yeah.
That's true. Has anybody else got a question? Last call for questions. Cool. So I've got one personal question for you. You've got a son who's 12?
Son is 6 and daughter who's 12. Yeah.
Daughter's 12. Does she write? Does she read your work?
She has read parts of... I don't think she's read a full novel from start to finish, but she has definitely read parts. And I think the answer, unfortunately, is yes. I think... fortunately/unfortunately for her, maybe. I think she thinks in stories and she reads and she sort of... I think she's a bit of a writer at heart, too. Actually, my son has written some amazing works. One is about zombie wars.
Right.
And, there's some great works coming from him also.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming to Marlborough. Thank you so much for talking to me about this book. Thank you for writing it so that I had to think about it so hard. I agree. I found the empty building really difficult. I wanted to move her from it. And also I thought when you were saying it, I thought she's also going for the first time in her life away alone. Her twin is gone. And I'm not a twin, so I can't imagine that feeling, but you can sort of imagine it.
That's why I wanted to rescue her and why I think Yasuko is such a... it had to be rough so that then she could transform. And
does she still have the suit?
Of course.
And does she wear it?
I hope so.
Yeah. Yasuko buys her a Chanel suit, doesn't she?
Yeah.
It's amazing. Anyway, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I hope you're all going to lots of other sessions. And we will say thank you to Anna.
Oh, thank you, Jane. Thank you.
Go forth into the sunshine.